I'm Curtis Talbot, and together with Joel Brown, we make up 2/3 of the NRCS's National Ecological Site Team, headquartered at the Jornada Experimental Range in Las Cruces. This is kind of the introductory talk. First, we'll just cover some of the real simple basics of ecological sites, just so I'm going to guess that most people in the room are familiar with it, but just as a brief background so we're all on the same sheet of music, talk about some of those aspects. Real brief introduction into some hydrology processes and how that will come into play with ecological sites, and then address or open it up our thoughts for some of the scale challenges that deal with hydrology and how it relates to ecological sites. We correlate ecological sites to a soil map unit component, and that traditionally that is an Order 2 soil survey. So 1 to 24,000 scale mapping. Within that Order 2 and sometimes Order 3 mapping, oftentimes there are consociations or one major soil component, but more frequently, particularly on rangelands, it's an association where you have multiple soil components. And within those multiple soil components, you can obviously then have multiple ecological sites within a map unit. And sometimes you'll have more than one map unit will make up an ecological site. So it's a little bit of a varied relationship. And the properties that make up those ecological sites, either the properties themselves or inferences derived from those properties, directly relate to the hydrology. And those both impact, again, kind of a complex situation. It impacts the hydrology impacts the ecological site, and the ecological site properties also impact the hydrology. And separating those sometimes can be, that's where it becomes tricky, and I guess that's where our profession comes into play. So just a brief example, a visual example of how these soil map units lay out. If you look up there in the upper right corner, there's a map unit ST. So there's an example of where you have, it's 80% of one soil series broken into two phases, but even though it's the same series, there's two different ecological sites. One of those phases is flooded, and so it correlates to a bottomland ecological site, where the other one does not have any overflow on it, and it is simply a clay ecological site. You look to the south, that BK map unit, there you have the predominant components are two distinct soil series, but yet they correlate to the same ecological site. The properties are close enough, so it correlates the same. Now, as just a kind of a little bit of an academic exercise, of course, a point to keep in mind is that any of these map units, and we all understand this, they're our own interpretation, or a human interpretation of what's happening on the landscape. They don't represent reality. Mother Nature did not draw that line, nor did she name one soil stellar and one soil Brino and another soil Doniana. Those are our interpretations, and so anytime what you find on the land is not going to be what you see on the map. But what the mapping represents is if your intent was to find a good example of a stellar clay loam or a clay ecological site, your best chances would be to go right in the middle of that polygon. As you move south and up to what appears to be a a braided alluvial fan, as you reach that, that map unit boundary, all that's really saying is you're increasing your chances of finding a Barino or a Doñana soil and less of a chance of finding a stellar. It doesn't necessarily mean that when you cross that line that you jump to a different soil component. So it's, we all understand that, but yet oftentimes when we turn to the map, we say, oh, well, we're on this side of the line, so therefore it's this soil or this ecological site, and nature just doesn't behave that way. Another just bit of semantics to keep in mind that at least is one of my pet peeves is still even within our own ecological site specialists within NRCS, you'll hear people refer to, I'm going to go out and I'm going to map ESDs. We don't map descriptions. You map ecological sites. The ecological site is the concept. An ESD is a document describing the properties that make it up as well as the interpretations of that. But you map ecological sites and you develop ecological site descriptions. And we do that, if you look at the inverted triangle there on the right, is NRCS's land resource hierarchy, and you'll see that what's circled there is the component. That is where we correlate the ecological site to, the soil component. The Surgo layer right above it, that's the mapping layer. So we don't correlate it to the map unit, we correlate it to the soil component that makes up the map unit. And again, the Surgo is traditionally your Order 2, Order 3 soil survey. Your StatsGo, with which many of you are probably familiar with, that's more your Order 4, Order 5 soil survey, or your general soil maps. Now the hydrology information, while it's important to developing ecological sites, I mean, you can't really separate it. It is integral to the ecological site and can't be separated. But as you look at hydrologic processes, we know that they are multi-scale as well. And one of the problems that we've run into in the past with our ecological site descriptions is we have some, if we've made a fault as an agency, we've put too much weight on the ecological site to be the be-all, end-all unit in which we carry all our information. Whereas we know that a lot of processes aren't appropriately captured at that scale, but that's the only place we have it, so we shove it in and make it fit. In reality, if you look at the suite of hydrologic processes, they correlate, and we may not have these arrows in the pointed to the exact scale. Some of them probably point to multiple scales, but the point I want you to like captured is that the processes correlate across different scales, and some processes are better captured at other scales compared to others. And it's probably not by default that we only put one arrow pointing to the component level or the ecological site level, because probably only a small portion of those hydrologic processes are appropriately captured at that scale, even though we shove all the information in there. This, and again, looking at this inverted triangle is another chance to point out that all this classification and hierarchy that we do is artificial. It's our own interpretation of what we see on the land. The only true point on that triangle that represents real data or reality is down at the pedon, soil pedon, where you're actually measuring information on the ground. Everything else is just an interpretation of what you've gathered or the observations that you've seen. Here's a traditional example of a state and transition model, which is really the heart and soul of our ecological site descriptions. Of course, what you've seen by showing some of the mapping, the ecological site represents the spatial concept of what we see. The state transition model takes into account the temporal relationship. So within a given, any given point on the ground is correlated to one ecological site. But for that ecological site, there can be multiple, as we all know, plant communities that can be expressed due to disturbances and management. As that varies across time, true, only one state will occur at only one point in the ground, but as you look at how that ecological site is mapped, you could have multiple states occurring across the landscape based on the history and use of that ecological site. And again, this is our traditional state transition model. You'll see it's very vegetation-centric. And it comes as no surprise. Vegetation is the easiest thing to see. I mean, it's even easier than digging a hole. And if you look at the history of why ecological sites were requested, it was for vegetation management. So to help develop stocking rates and management systems to keep the plant communities that you want on a piece of ground. But what we know is that we know that the site, the vegetation is simply just a reflection of the site and the management and disturbance that exists there. We have not done a good job of incorporating the other bits of information, and I'm not sure necessarily that we want to smash it all into this diagram. It would get pretty, it could get real busy real quick. But what we know is, if you look at those boxes or those states, as you approach the edge of that box, you approach what we refer to as the threshold. And once you pass that threshold, you cross a tipping point in which it would require a large amount of energy to get back, usually some sort of major restoration practice to get back to a different box or a different state. And we know that hydrology is represented, and hydrologic processes are represented by that threshold, by that boundary. And if you look in the majority of our ESDs that are currently published, even though we know that conceptually, you won't find much record in there of that discussion. So we have a lot of room to grow, but we do know that those boundaries are defined by, in many cases, by hydrologic processes. And we also know that crossing those thresholds, it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. It also affects hydrology at a larger scale. When you change management, use of management to a point where it crosses a threshold, you have, in many cases, permanently affected the hydrology and how that water flows across the landscape or through the landscape. So it's not always clear. It'd be nice if we could just draw, go back to that, that one slide that I showed, where if you could say you could break out unique hydrologic processes. Okay, this one belongs at this scale, this one belongs at that scale, and a one-to-one relationship. But it doesn't happen that way. Just an example, some work been done by one of our retired colleagues. Now, why is it jumping? Does this mean I'm running out of time? Kicking me. One of our retired colleagues, Steve Barker, has been looking at some NRI data and correlating them with our ecological sites and trying to make them a little bit better. And, one of the things that we've been hoping for with our NRI data is, this will be able to use these to help define and help describe our ecological sites and fill out our ESDs. And you would think that, a good, it's like, well, you could draw a comparison between soil site stability, how well those little soil PEDs, I'm not done yet, hang together, compared to soil, the rate of soil loss. Well, if you look at the R² value there, 0.09, for a semi-desert loam in the Great Basin, that's not a real good correlation. If you look at hydrologic function, this is if you're looking at the attributes of rangeland health, soil site stability is one, hydrologic function is another. If you compare it against runoff, well, it's still nothing real great, but the R² jumps to a 0.5. So for this particular ecological site, those rangeland health indicators that make up the hydrologic function have a much tighter fit than the soil site stability. But we know that this is not, what we're seeing from Steve's work and what we've seen from our own observations and work is, we don't want to jump to the conclusion and say that, therefore, that ecological sites are more tightly correlated to hydrologic function than they are to soil site stability. It is for that ecological site, and I would dare guess it would even vary between the state of a given ecological site, that you're going to see differences in how these correlate. So as we use the NRI data, it's you got to be, what our managers would like nothing more is for us to, for someone like Steve Barth to do some work, and then they say, okay, this is how, here's the cookbook approach. We'll run this across every ecological site in the country, and we'll make lots of miles out of it, and we'll have good answers. When we can't escape the hard work of each one. Really has to be identified individually. It's just the way it is. Okay, I will let the computer wants to jump to this slide. We'll go there now. I mentioned earlier that within that state transition model, we know as you approach that threshold between states that those certain hydrologic processes are changing, and we could capture that in the ESD. But we also know then that, like I mentioned before, that it changes it over the whole landscape as well, not just within the ecological site. It's a little schematic that from many of us have seen this multiple times from Dr. Brandon Besselmeyer's work, where if you simply looked at the hydrology over this landscape, there are very stable soils, at least on there towards the right, at that upper end of the landscape, and although vulnerable, somewhat fairly restorable as you move down to the bottom where you have the run-in sites. But on the other side, you have although similar when you just look at it, it has that soil is more of a relic basin floor that is very erodible by nature, and how the hydrology plays out across those ecological sites is going to vary. So in closing, as we work on ecological sites, there's a series of questions that we have to ask. The primary one is do we have the right soils grouped together? Do we have the right correlation? Because if you have that wrong, then everything else is going to be wrong. But once you can assume that the soils are correctly grouped together, those site dynamics, how are they affected by the hydrology as it moves across or through the site? And then the site dynamics themselves, the transitions, the disturbances, how do they affect hydrology? Kind of a chicken and egg question that you have to tease out. And then the final question is the ecological site truly the right scale at which we want to capture this, or do we need to develop other reports, other products at other scales where we need to hang some of these hydrologic processes?